Well, it's now been about 48 hours since the polls started to close. In the midterms, the dust hasn't settled yet. We still don't know who's going to be in control of the House or the Senate because ballots in some states still yet to be counted. At this hour, the Senate has 3 undecided races: Arizona, Nevada, and Georgia. We could find out the Arizona results at any moment. Keep your eyes glued right here, because we're going to break in the second we know something. We also won't know who won Georgia for another month. But if Democrats win the 2 Western seats, not going to matter. The Peach State, that is meaningless because Democrats will have 50 states plus the vice presidential tie-breaking vote. The House still leaning in favor of Republicans, but the way things have gone so far, who knows? Anything could happen. We know that pundits and polls got a lot wrong. There was no red wave. Turns out voters have much more nuanced opinions on issues like inflation, crime, and abortion, and different things are important to different people. We know people are very sick of the gridlock, the fighting, and the money wasting in D.C., but according to President Biden, Democrats should just continue what they're doing because it's amazing. Watch.
75% of voters say the country is heading into the wrong direction, despite the results of last night. What in the next 2 years do you intend to do differently to change people's opinion of the direction of the country, particularly as you contemplate a run for president in 2024?
Nothing, because they're just finding out what we're doing.
Yeah, they're just finding out what we're doing. You're finding out high crime and inflation. Wonderful.
Republicans have said it's time for a bit of a change-up. Among those changes, House Minority Whip Steve Scalise reportedly has his eye on the speakership. Watch.
The bottom line is we're going to have a Republican House majority. We ran on a commitment to America and things that we would do to get our economy back on track, lower gas prices, the things that people care about, and we'll be able to do those in the House.
In the House, but because there wasn't that massive red wave, Republicans don't have a mandate to pass their wish list. And if Democrats win the Senate, it'll be even tougher. So where do we stand tonight? And even if there is a party shift, does it matter at this point? Joining me now, former Hawaii Democratic Congresswoman and former Democrat, Tulsi Gabbard. Welcome back, Tulsi.
Thanks, Kennedy. It's great to see you.
So let's talk a little bit about what happened on Tuesday night. Do you feel a kinship with voters? Because you left the Democrat Party. Voters have not embraced either party. Has Atlas shrugged?
You know, I'm not a political pundit reading the political maps, but if I'm a voter looking at what's going on in Washington right now, really all I care about is whether or not the people in charge are actually going to do their job and start listening to the challenges that people across the country are facing. You know, anytime people talk about red waves or blue this or whatever, I just tune out, probably like a lot of other people, because those colors don't mean a whole lot. What really means something to me is if leaders are stepping up and saying, you know what, we're going to fight to reduce crime in your communities. We're going to work together across party lines to be able to try to reduce this increasing inflation that's hurting people's pocketbooks so much. We're actually going to deal with the open border and the unprecedented numbers of people crossing our border illegally. I think you look at the things that people are really concerned about. Democrats, Republicans, this is not a team sport. You know, there are real lives and real consequences to the decisions that these people are making in Washington.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point because we are in a different place than we were in 2016 or even in 2020, where, you know, people, it was entertaining to engage in that political blood sport because the economy was humming along. It was pre-pandemic, and, you know, we didn't have the kind of worries that we do now. So when the president says he's not going to do anything differently, if you were advising him, how would you tell him to correct course, to be a little bit more sensitive to voters who are very much in pain?
I was very disappointed to hear him say that because it tells me two really important things. Number one is, in some ways, it's not surprising that he would say, we'll do nothing different in the White House because of how out of touch they've shown that they are. You know, when he says, oh, there's no inflation, when inflation is going up, 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 you have Kamala Harris is saying, oh, no, we don't have open borders, and yet the numbers of people illegally crossing the borders is increasing. There's no crime epidemic in this country. Well, yeah, go and talk to a lot of the people who are being impacted by this crime. So they've proven they're out of touch. The second thing that shows me, frankly, is just arrogance, because to me, the great The signs of a great leader, or even a good leader, is somebody who's constantly trying to do better, listening to the people that they are serving and saying, hey, how can I serve you better? What can I do better to help make sure that your quality of life is improved, that you and your kids feel safe in your homes and your communities? Even someone who's doing a good job should be asking those questions. And so for the President of the United States to just say, nah, status quo, if people learn how awesome we are, then maybe we'll be awesome. But that's not what people are seeing, and that's not what people are living.
No, and maybe in the long term, some of those policies, I mean, I don't have a great deal of faith in it because I am a fan of limited government. And I think the less government does, the more freedom that people have, the more decisions people can make for themselves, the happier, more prosperous they will ultimately be. But, you know, let's say at some point, sure, you know, these Democrat policies, these statist policies, they might take root. They might allow people to turn a corner, but what is critically important is the here and now. And, you know, what's hard for me to stomach watching all of this, regardless of party, is how incapable the president and the vice president are at articulating what is really going on with the economy. And, you know, also having the sensitivity to talk about solving these problems, because, yes, first you have to name it, and then you have to come up with a set of real solutions. They are incapable of doing that. Now, when you left the Democrat Party, obviously, there was a lot of focus and a lot of attention on that. How did you decide which candidates to endorse?
Candidates that I saw who were willing to not just toe the party line, Kennedy, candidates who were both on the campaign trail and in private and in public saying, hey, look, this is about a problem that is bigger than just one party. These problems are not going to be solved just by switching the party that's in control. It's about having courageous leaders who are rooted in the Constitution, who recognize the threats to our fundamental freedoms enshrined in the Constitution and Bill of Rights, and who are willing to stand up toe-to-toe to leaders in Washington, whether they be Democrat or Republican, on behalf of the American people. We have too many cowards in Washington who react and make decisions that are fear-based, rather than recognizing that our founders envisioned this Constitution, Bill of Rights being the North Star, being those guidelines with which our leaders make decisions. Those are the kinds of people that I was glad to go out and campaign for so that they could fulfill that promise.
Well, I think a lot of Democrats and certainly a lot of Republicans pay lip service to the Constitution. I would not call many of them constitutionalists, save for people like Mike Lee, Rand Paul, and Thomas Massie, people like that who are very serious about implementing limited government. So is the way forward a third party and breaking up the two-party duopoly, and how do you do that?
I don't know the answer to the how do you do that. I think the reality is that there are a majority of Americans, and the polls and the statistics have shown this year after year after year. There are more Americans who don't identify with either party. I think most people in this country, I encourage and should be voting for each individual candidate based on who they are and what they stand for, what they're committed to, what their principles are, rather than just saying, well, I'm a Republican or I'll vote Republican, or I'm a Democrat, so I'll vote Democrat. That system has failed us for a really long time. I think the most important thing, we got to fix the system, but as we do this, we as voters need to speak for and choose leaders who will actually represent our interests, who are rooted in the Constitution, and have their priorities straight.
And I think you saw more of that on Tuesday night. I really believe that people are taking things issue by issue, and they're not just going with the party line, because frankly the parties have failed them. Tulsi, thanks so much for being here. I always appreciate talking to you.
Thanks so much, Kennedy.
Absolutely. Double shockers. Woo, whale tail.